There is a show that begins with a drunk old man breaking into his teenage grandson's bedroom in the middle of the night, dragging the kid out of a warm bed, and telling him they're going to space. That's the first 30 seconds. Most shows spend their entire pilot episode carefully establishing the setting, introducing the characters one at a time, laying the tracks the story will run on. Rick and Morty just opens the door and starts running. And somewhere between that chaotic first night on air and the multiversal wars, and the philosophical gut punches, and the interdimensional cable marathons, and the love that neither of its two main characters would describe as love but that everyone watching can see clearly, this show quietly became one of the most meticulously crafted, deeply weird, and genuinely moving things to ever air on television. Not in spite of the burping, not in spite of the gross-out comedy. Because of it. Because of the way it uses all of that noise as cover for something much quieter running underneath. So settle in. Get comfortable. Let the light in the room drop a little. We are going to spend the next couple of hours sitting with this show, turning it over slowly, looking at all the small details, and the enormous lore, and the real science and the behind-the-scenes history that most people never took the time to find. We are going to move through 12 sections, each one a deep dive into a different layer of what Rick and Morty actually is. We will look at where it came from, at the physics it's built on, at the hidden things the animators placed for the attentive viewer, at the characters whose depth most conversations barely scratch the surface of, at the civilizations the show constructed in its universe, at the production secrets, at the moments when the show reached into the real world and changed it, at the darkest corners of its mythology, at the theories that turned out to be true, at the music and the language and the small choices that add up, and finally at what the show has become and where it's going. There is no rush. This is made for winding down. Every section is going to breathe. If you drift a little, that's fine. The show will still be here when you surface. Let's begin. Part 1. The origin story. Nobody fully knows where Rick and Morty came from. The story of how Rick and Morty came into existence is itself a bit like one of its own episodes. It starts with a strange impulse made under pressure, takes a series of turns that should have led nowhere, passes through a moment where the entire project almost dissolved, and arrives somewhere nobody originally planned to be. It's a story about frustration becoming creativity, about two people finding each other's particular brand of weird compelling, and about the kind of accident that only looks like fate once it's finished. Let's go back to 2006. Justin Roiland was in his mid-20s, working in California in television production. He'd had some success with smaller creative projects, but the larger pitches weren't landing. And at some point that year, he received a rejection from Cartoon Network. The specific project doesn't matter as much as the feeling it produced. He was frustrated. He was annoyed in that particular way that creative people get when the thing they made didn't connect with the people who were supposed to receive it. And he decided, in the particular way that frustrated creative people sometimes decide things, to make something deliberately transgressive in response. Not to submit it, not to show it around, just to make it. Just to have something exist that felt like an expression of irritation rather than an attempt to please. What he made was a short film called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty. The title was engineered carefully to avoid legal complications. His two characters were named Doc Smith and Marty McDonald's, names that obviously gestured at Doc Brown and Marty McFly from Back to the Future, without reproducing those names exactly. The reference to Robert Zemeckis' film was unmistakable, but the cover was technically present. The content itself was crude, transgressive, designed to be uncomfortable. This was not a carefully considered artistic statement. It was a 20-something animator venting frustration into animation software. But then something happened when Roiland sat down to edit the audio. He listened back to the voices he'd done for Doc and Marty, and he found something in them. The way Doc spoke that particular cadence, that slightly slurred, overwhelming, intermittently interrupted quality of someone who is simultaneously extraordinarily intelligent and not entirely sober, that clicked. It felt like a real person. And the way Marty sounded underneath it, nervous, stammering, perpetually trying to process a situation that was moving too fast, had its own reality. The two voices in conversation with each other had something live in them. Even in something made purely out of spite, there was an actual dynamic. Roiland didn't shelve the characters after making the short. He kept developing them, doing more voice sessions, accumulating more material. This content eventually made its way to Channel 101, which was a monthly short film festival in Los Angeles that Dan Harmon had co-founded. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Channel 101 actually was. Harmon had started it because he believed in giving strange things a platform before they had earned one by conventional standards. The format was democratic in a specific way. Anyone could submit a short film formatted like a television pilot. A live audience would vote on which ones they wanted to see continue. No network executives, no focus groups, just people in a room responding to things. The festival had a reputation for elevating work that wouldn't have found a home anywhere else. That was the point. Roiland had been submitting work to Channel 101 for about a year before the Doc and Marty material came along, starting in 2004. His submissions had a consistent characteristic: they provoked confused reactions from audiences, not dismissive reactions, not hostile reactions, confusion, which is, if you think about it, an interesting starting point. Confusion means the thing is doing something the audience's existing frameworks don't accommodate. It means the work is genuinely unusual. Harmon, who had spent years at Channel 101 looking specifically for unusual things, noticed Roiland's work. He noticed the confusion it produced and was drawn to it in the specific way that one kind of unusual person recognizes another. The two of them began talking, then collaborating, then eventually working on a concept together that drew on what Roiland had been building with Doc and Marty, but transformed it into something new. The grandfatherly mentor figure became a genius alcoholic scientist. The young apprentice became a nervous, anxious teenager. The Back to the Future parody became a science fiction comedy with its own internal logic. And the whole thing stopped being about Doc Brown and Marty McFly and started being about Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith. The pitch they brought to Adult Swim, according to accounts from both of them, was developed and written essentially in a single day, one day. The show that would go on to run for multiple seasons, accumulate an enormous global fan base, influence science communication, force McDonald's to bring back a 20-year-old dipping sauce, and become one of the most discussed animated programs in the history of the medium. That show was outlined and pitched on the kind of timeline most people use to write a grocery list or answer a backlog of emails. There's something very on-brand about this for a show whose characters frequently improvise their way out of situations that should have killed them long ago. But here's where it almost fell apart. This is the part of the origin story that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Adult Swim's initial response to the pitch included a specific concern. They weren't sure about Justin Roiland voicing both of the show's main characters. Sit with that for a moment. The show is built around two characters. Everything the show is, every dynamic, every relationship, every moment of comedy, and every moment of genuine feeling, all of it depends on Rick and Morty. And Roiland was doing both voices. Not similar voices, not characters that share a vocal template. Two genuinely distinct voices that coexist in a single person's range, each with its own texture and rhythm and emotional register. When executives raised concerns about this, Roiland and Harmon did what people who are making something and suddenly realize it might not happen tend to do. They tried to solve the problem the conventional way. They auditioned other actors. Multiple people came in and read for Rick. Multiple people read for Morty. And every time, something was absent that nobody could quite name but everyone could feel. The specific quality that makes the relationship between Rick and Morty feel like a real relationship, that specific dynamic came from the fact that Roiland was doing both of them. When a different person reads Rick and a different person reads Morty, you get two performances. When Roiland does it, you get something that sounds like a conversation a person is having with a version of themselves, which is on some level exactly what the Rick and Morty relationship is, thematically. It's a man and his emotional surrogate. It's a person and the version of themselves they could have been if they'd stayed soft. It's a genius who needs someone who isn't a genius nearby to remember what being human feels like. All of that is encoded in the voices belonging to the same throat. Harmon described this later as a crisis that accidentally became one of the show's foundational strengths. The crisis forced them to rework Morty on the page. In early drafts, Morty was more passive, more purely reactive, more completely at the mercy of Rick's momentum. The rewrite made him sharper, more capable of pushing back, more present in scenes as a genuine perspective rather than just a receiver of Rick's energy, which made Morty a significantly better character. The crisis that nearly killed the project left the show stronger than the version that would have existed without it. Adult Swim gave the green light. The show was going to happen. It premiered on the 2nd of December 2013. That first episode pulled in 1.1 million viewers on its debut night. By television's macro standards, not a large number. By Adult Swim standards, for that time slot, for that type of content, it was more than enough. The numbers grew. The second episode, Lawnmower Dog, drew 1.51 million viewers. Anatomy Park drew 1.3 million. Me Seeks and Destroy drew 1.61 million. The audience was finding it, and the people who found it were staying. One last thing about the origin worth carrying with you. The designation C-137, which becomes one of the most important pieces of terminology in the show's entire universe, refers to cesium-137. This is a real element. It appears on the periodic table as a radioactive isotope of cesium, produced as a byproduct of nuclear fission. It's one of the more concerning radioactive materials associated with nuclear accidents. It was among the isotopes released during both the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 and the Fukushima disaster in 2011. It has a half-life of approximately 30 years. It behaves chemically similarly to potassium, which means it's readily absorbed by biological systems, which is part of what makes it dangerous in contamination scenarios. The writers never explicitly confirmed that this specific isotope was the intended reference. They tend to give pleasantly ambiguous answers about things like this. But knowing the show's habit of layering meaning into terminology that sounds like it might just be flavor, it seems significant that they chose, out of all possible letter-number combinations, a radioactive isotope associated with nuclear catastrophe to designate their primary Rick's home dimension. Like the dimension itself has been contaminated. Like C-137, carries something toxic that it spreads wherever it goes. It's the kind of thing you either notice or you don't, and if you don't, the show still functions perfectly. But if you do, it sits there and does quiet work. Rick moved back in with the Smith family 1 month before the events of the pilot episode. 1 month. We learn this in passing, mentioned almost offhandedly, but the implication is significant. Everything we see in the show, all of the adventures, all of the chaos, all of the way the family has adapted to having Rick around, is happening to a household that has only had Rick in it for 30 days. The family is still adjusting when we arrive. The dynamic between Rick and Jerry, between Rick and Beth, between Rick and his grandchildren, all of it is still forming when the pilot begins. We walked in at the very beginning. What the Smith family's daily life looked like in the month before the pilot is something the show never depicts. We see hints in the way each family member relates to Rick, in the way his presence in their house still has the quality of a disturbance that hasn't fully settled. Beth is hopeful and slightly desperate. Jerry is resentful and trying to hide it. Morty is uncertain, still figuring out what his relationship with this man is supposed to be. Summer barely acknowledges him, which might be the most honest response of all. She's treating him like a stranger who moved into her house because that's exactly what he is. The way the pilot introduces Rick's character is worth examining in detail because it front-loads everything important. In the very first scene, Rick bursts into Morty's room drunk and announces they're going to go somewhere. He's holding a device. He's rambling about something big, something important, something Morty absolutely has to see. And then he passes out mid-sentence. The announcement was a false alarm. The device was nothing important. Rick was just drunk and wanted company, and used the framing of urgency to get it, and then couldn't sustain the performance long enough to follow through. This scene is the entire show in miniature. Rick is brilliant, and he's lying about why he needs Morty nearby, and the excuse collapses before it even gets started. That's the relationship. That's every episode. Enormous scientific achievement wrapped around a simple emotional need that the enormous scientific achievement is partially designed to obscure. The show took Roiland's initial concept, the Doc and Marty relationship, the older mentor figure and the younger uncertain companion, and pushed it somewhere Doc Brown and Marty McFly never went. Because Back to the Future, for all its charm, is fundamentally an optimistic film series. Time travel is used there to correct mistakes, to improve outcomes, to make things right. Rick's version of the same dynamic is fundamentally tragic. The technology doesn't fix anything. The intelligence doesn't solve the actual problems. The adventures make the relationship necessary without making it healthy. And the whole thing runs on love that neither character has the vocabulary to describe, expressed mostly through proximity and implicit trust and the particular quality of still being there after everything. Dan Harmon's contribution to this was the narrative architecture. Harmon had developed, through his work on Community and through his reading of various storytelling theorists, including Joseph Campbell, a story structure he called the story circle, an 8-step cycle that he applied to individual episodes and to longer arcs. The story circle starts with a character in a zone of comfort, who wants something, enters an unfamiliar situation, adapts to it, gets what they wanted, pays a price for it, returns to their familiar situation, and has changed. Every episode of Rick and Morty, at various levels of explicitness, runs some version of this structure. Even the episodes that seem most anarchic have a shape. Harmon builds the shape even when the content is deliberately trying to evade it. This structure is part of why the show feels emotionally coherent even in its most chaotic episodes. The surface can be as wild as the writers want it to be because the structure underneath is holding everything in place. The audience feels the shape even when they can't articulate it. Episodes feel complete even when they end ambiguously. This is Harmon's specific expertise made available to Roiland's specific imagination, and the combination produces something neither could have made alone. Hey, before we go further, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love seeing where people find these videos. And if you're enjoying having this on while you wind down, hitting subscribe helps a lot. It's free, it takes 1 second, and it makes it possible to keep making things like this. Okay, let's keep going. Part 2. The real science, what the show actually got right about physics. There is a version of watching Rick and Morty where you enjoy it as pure creative comedy and never think too hard about whether the science holds up. That version is completely valid and a good way to spend an evening. There's another version where you start pulling at the threads and discover that the show's scientific underpinning is considerably more carefully considered than the burps and the slapstick would suggest. The writers, when they're constructing episodes around scientific concepts, tend to do their homework. Not to the point where accuracy constrains the story always wins, but to the point where the scientific reference has real roots. Let's start with the multiverse, because the multiverse is the engine that everything else runs on. The concept of parallel universes of other versions of reality running alongside our own, containing different outcomes of the same events, inhabited by alternate versions of the people we know, is not a fantasy the show invented. It's a legitimate, ongoing scientific conversation that has been happening in physics departments since the 1950s. The specific framework that Rick and Morty most directly draws from is called the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, and it was proposed in 1957 by a physicist named Hugh Everett III, who was at the time a graduate student at Princeton. To understand why Everett proposed this, you need to understand the problem he was trying to solve. Quantum mechanics, which is the branch of physics that deals with the behavior of matter and energy at the smallest scales, produces results that are deeply strange. When you observe something at the quantum scale, say, you measure the position of an electron, the act of measurement itself seems to change the system you're measuring. Before measurement, the electron doesn't have a definite position. It has a range of possible positions, each associated with a different probability. This is called superposition. The electron is, in a specific mathematical sense, in all of those positions at once until you look. When you look, the wave function, the mathematical description of all those possibilities collapses. The electron is suddenly in one position. All the other possibilities it could have occupied are gone. The standard interpretation of this, called the Copenhagen interpretation, essentially says the act of measurement selects one outcome and the rest disappear. This is philosophically unsatisfying if you think about it for more than a few minutes. Where do the other possibilities go? What happens to the versions of reality where the electron was somewhere else? The Copenhagen interpretation says that question doesn't matter. The measurement happened, one outcome was selected, the rest don't exist. Everett found this deeply unsatisfying, and his response, his many worlds interpretation, says something radical. All the outcomes happen. They each happen in their own branch of reality. When a quantum event has multiple possible outcomes, the universe doesn't pick one, it forks. Every possible outcome plays out in a separate, real, physical branch. The electron isn't in one position after you measure it. It's in every possible position, in different branches of a reality that is just divided. Now, scale this up. Every quantum event, happening in every particle, in every atom, in every object and creature and energy field in the observable universe, happening continuously. The number of branching events per second is incomprehensibly large. The resulting proliferation of reality, the number of parallel branches that would exist, is a number so vast it exceeds any useful description. What you get is something that, functionally, looks a lot like Rick opening a green portal in the air and stepping sideways into a different version of the world. Real physicists, when asked about the show, tend to point out that the many worlds interpretation, even if it's correct, doesn't come with a travel mechanism. The branches don't have addresses. You can't engineer a portal gun to take you between them. The geometry of how branched realities relate to each other spatially isn't something current physics describes. But the underlying principle that quantum mechanics implies some form of branching reality, that other versions of events really happen somewhere, that there is a sense in which every possible outcome of every possible event is physically real, is a genuine scientific hypothesis, taken seriously by a non-trivial number of professional physicists. Columbia University's Brian Greene, who is among the most respected physicists currently working and who has spent considerable effort making physics accessible to non-specialists, has written about at least 9 distinct types of multiverse, that physics can theoretically support different kinds of parallel reality arising from different aspects of cosmological and quantum theory. MIT's Max Tegmark has proposed a mathematical framework that supports up to 4 distinct types of parallel universe. These are not fringe proposals from the edges of the scientific community. They're serious ideas that appear in peer-reviewed journals and are debated at conferences. The show is drawing from real intellectual territory, even when its specific implementations of that territory are pure science fiction. The episode A Wrinkle in Time is the show's most explicit engagement with quantum mechanics as a visual grammar. After an argument among Rick, Morty, and Summer leaves a moment of decision unresolved, time literally fractures. The screen splits, showing multiple versions of the scene running simultaneously. The 3 characters exist in multiple states at once, their timelines diverging based on the different choices available. This is a visual representation of quantum superposition, the idea that a system in an unresolved state is, in a specific physical sense, in multiple states at once. The show isn't misusing the concept here, it's dramatizing it. The physics isn't accurate in its implementation. Time doesn't split because of interpersonal disagreements, but the conceptual move it's making is a real one. Dark matter gets used in the show as a fuel source for Rick's spaceship. This too has real grounding. Dark matter is among the most significant unsolved problems in contemporary astrophysics. We can't see it. It doesn't interact with light, but we know it's there because the way galaxies rotate doesn't make sense without it. The outer edges of galaxies move too fast, relative to the visible mass present, and the only way to account for this is if there's substantially more mass present than we can detect. Current estimates suggest that roughly 27% of the universe's total mass energy content is dark matter. We've spent decades trying to directly detect a dark matter particle and haven't succeeded. In 2009, a physicist theorized in some detail how a dark matter engine might conceptually function. The design involves an intake at the front of a spacecraft that collects dark matter particles as the vehicle moves through space. Those particles are then channeled into an engine where they interact with each other or with regular matter, releasing energy that provides thrust. The spacecraft essentially feeds on the invisible medium it's traveling through. Rick's spaceship operating on a dark matter principle isn't purely invented. It's extrapolated from a real, if speculative, theoretical proposal. The Love Potion episode, officially titled Rick Potion Number 9, is a case study in how the show uses real biology to ground its escalating absurdity. Rick's love potion is derived from a compound related to vole pheromones. This is not arbitrary. Voles, small rodents, have been the subject of considerable scientific interest because they're one of the relatively few mammal species that form monogamous pair bonds, and the mechanism behind this bonding behavior has been partially identified. Oxytocin and vasopressin, working through specific receptor systems in vole brains that differ from non-monogamous rodent species, appear to be significantly involved in creating these pair bonds. A scientist trying to engineer a love compound could plausibly start with vole neurochemistry. The show's choice of voles as a source material isn't random. It's a reference to a real body of biological research. What goes wrong afterward, the cascade of mutations, Rick's various failed attempts at correction, the eventual complete transformation of most of humanity, follows a logic that is also grounded in real biology's most fundamental principle. Complex systems respond to intervention in ways that are difficult to predict. Rick introduces a compound. It spreads via flu vectors. The flu virus mutates. The mutation propagates in ways Rick didn't model accurately. He tries to correct it with praying mantis DNA, and the correction makes things worse in a different direction. This is not a casual observation. The history of well-intentioned ecological and medical interventions going badly wrong is long and specific. Introducing one corrective factor into a biological system frequently produces unforeseen cascading effects that end up being worse than the original problem. The episode, dressed in body horror and dark comedy, is running a very dark version of a very real principle. The simulation hypothesis shows up across several episodes. Rick, Morty, and Jerry being captured and placed in a simulated reality by aliens who want to extract information from Rick's mind draws on a genuine philosophical and scientific conversation. Nick Bostrom's 2003 paper, arguing that we're probably living in a simulation, has become one of the more widely discussed ideas in contemporary philosophy of science. The argument runs roughly: if civilizations eventually develop the ability to run detailed, full-fidelity simulations of their ancestors, and if they choose to do so, then, statistically speaking, most conscious experiences are occurring inside simulations rather than in base reality, because the ratio of simulated people to real people would be enormous. This has been engaged with seriously by physicists, philosophers, and various technologists. It's not settled, but it's not nothing. Rick's bored, mildly irritated response to being inside a simulation, essentially, yes, of course. Let's just get out, is the show's way of suggesting that a person who has thought carefully about these ideas would have internalized the simulation hypothesis long ago and moved on. The show treats it as a solved question for Rick, which is itself a character detail. Rick finds the simulation hypothesis uninteresting because he accepted it as probably true and filed it away. The episode Roy, A Life Well Lived, the game in the alien amusement park, where you connect to a simulator and live out an entire human life, is doing something elegant with the simulation conversation. Roy lives to 73. He has a career. He falls in love. He gets sick. He manages a carpet store for many years. He experiences the full emotional texture of a human life, with its disappointments and satisfactions and the particular quality of old age, looking back on choices made long ago. And then Morty takes off the headset, and Roy's entire existence is over. The question the episode is quietly asking is whether Roy's experiences were real. They felt real to Roy. The grief felt genuine. The love felt genuine. The carpet store felt genuinely tedious in a way that years of tedium creates. If the subjective experience is indistinguishable from the experience of a life lived in base reality, is there a meaningful difference? The show presents this without a clear answer, which is the honest position. There isn't one. Philosophers have been arguing about it for centuries under different terminologies, and the current consensus is essentially, we don't know. There's a small mathematical detail in the show's background that genuine physicists have noticed and appreciated. In various scenes where Rick's equations are visible on boards, on screens, on paper, time is written in vector notation rather than as a simple scalar variable. This is a subtle choice. In standard physics, time is typically treated as a scalar, a single number representing a point on a one-dimensional axis. Writing it as a vector implies that time has direction, that its orientation through space-time is a meaningful geometric property that can be worked with mathematically. Treating time as a vector is a formal move that connects to serious theoretical work on time's nature and its relationship to other dimensions. Someone on the production team either knew enough physics to make this choice deliberately or hired someone who did. The Dyson sphere is another concept the show references in ways that connect to real scientific discourse. A Dyson sphere proposed by physicist Freeman Dyson in 1960 is a hypothetical structure that a sufficiently advanced civilization might build around its home star to capture the full energy output of that star. Our sun produces an enormous amount of energy, most of which goes unused because it radiates in all directions through empty space. A Dyson sphere would capture essentially all of it. The energy available to a civilization that builds one would be so vast as to be almost incomprehensible by our standards. The show occasionally references this kind of megastructure energy harvesting in its depictions of advanced alien civilizations, treating it as the kind of thing that Rick would consider elementary rather than impressive. The concept of quantum entanglement, the phenomenon where two particles become correlated in such a way that the state of one instantly influences the state of the other, regardless of the distance between them, appears in the show's logic in various episodes. Entanglement is one of the most counterintuitive verified facts in physics. Einstein described it as spooky action at a distance and spent considerable effort trying to prove it was incomplete or wrong. Experiments conducted since his death have confirmed that entanglement is real and that the correlation between entangled particles is genuinely instantaneous over any distance. The show uses entanglement as part of the logical underpinning of some of Rick's communications technology and of certain aspects of how the portal gun interacts with the fabric of reality. The observer effect, the fact that in quantum mechanics, measuring a system changes the system, shows up in multiple episodes as a narrative mechanic. The episode A Wrinkle in Time is the most direct engagement with this. The indeterminacy of the moment is maintained by the character's inability to observe and collapse it. The show is using the observer effect not just as a clever plot device but as a meditation on how the act of paying attention changes what you're paying attention to, which is, if you're feeling generous, also something the show does with its audience. The show is different depending on whether you're paying attention or not. The version you see when you're watching carefully is not the same version that exists when you're watching casually. There is a real thing called quantum suicide. It's a philosophical thought experiment rather than something anyone has actually attempted, but the principle is grounded in the many worlds interpretation. The argument goes, if the many worlds interpretation is correct, then in every quantum event that determines whether you live or die, there is a branch in which you survive. From your own subjective perspective, you always survive because the version of you that doesn't survive isn't experiencing anything. A person who accepts the many worlds interpretation and applies it to their own situation could, in theory, play Russian roulette with a real gun and be confident that they will subjectively survive every time because there will always be a branch where they did. The branches where they don't survive exist, but they don't have access to them. Rick's apparent disregard for personal risk might be, at some level, the expression of exactly this logic. A person who genuinely believed in quantum immortality, who accepted that from their own subjective perspective, death is always a branch they don't experience, would behave differently from a person who thinks death is final. They would be more reckless. They would walk into situations that should be lethal with the calm confidence of someone who has done the math and concluded that they'll always wake up on the other side of it. Rick's specific flavor of fearlessness might not be nihilism, exactly. It might be the logical endpoint of taking quantum mechanics seriously and applying it to your own existence. Part 3. The hidden layer Easter eggs and background details. Rick and Morty is built for multiple viewings, in a way that goes beyond what the show itself would ever announce. The creators, the writers, the animators, and the background artists make deliberate choices to reward people who are paying close attention. Background details that don't draw attention to themselves. Visual jokes that have nothing to do with the main scene's content. Continuity threads running quietly beneath the louder storylines. Long-range foreshadowing planted in episodes that aired before what its foreshadowing was even fully conceived. These deserve to be taken slowly. The pilot episode, which aired on the 2nd of December 2013, contains a moment at the interdimensional customs checkpoint that functions as a visual love letter to the science fiction genre that preceded the show. The crowd of alien creatures visible in the background is not generic alien design. If you pause and examine it, you find specific characters from specific properties. A prawn from District 9, the alien from Ridley Scott's franchise, Moonanites from Aqua Teen Hunger Force. These aren't random. The show is, in its first few minutes of existence, identifying its influences and acknowledging the genre it's working within. Before Rick has said anything particularly clever, before we know what the show's sensibility is, the background of the second scene is already telling you what kind of thing this is. It knows where it came from. In the episode, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, which is the first major Citadel episode, there's a post-credit scene set in Rick's bedroom. Rick enters while Jerry sits on his cot and laments the departure of Doofus Rick. What makes the scene remarkable isn't the Rick-Jerry dynamic, which is familiar, it's the wall. Rick has a wall covered in photographs connected by colored strings in the style of a conspiracy theorist's evidence board. On that wall, visible if you look carefully, are photographs of characters from earlier episodes. A Cronenberg monster, Mr. Meeseeks, Prince Nebulon, Doctor, Xenon Bloom from Anatomy Park? Rick is tracking something. He's mapping patterns. His bedroom reveals a mind that is constantly processing, categorizing, connecting. This alone is interesting as character detail. But on that wall, partially visible, is also a photograph of Aberdolf Linkler, a character who doesn't appear until the following episode. Rick already knows about someone who hasn't entered his life yet, at least from the viewer's perspective. The show doesn't comment on this, it just puts it there. Whether it means Rick's awareness extends in non-linear ways, or whether it's a background detail placed by an animator who happened to include next episode's character in the frame, has never been confirmed. The show tends to give answers that could support either reading. The parasite egg detail is one of the most satisfying pieces of foreshadowing in the entire series. Morty Night Run. The episode about Morty trying to save an alien assassin comes immediately before Total Recall, which is the episode where memory-implanting parasites infest the Smith house, and the family has to figure out who among their supposed friends and family members is real. The cause of the infestation is never explained in Total Recall itself. But in Morty Night Run, there's a scene where Rick collects what he describes as shrooms, picking up green rocks. Clinging to those rocks, visible if you're looking at the right part of the frame, are small pink eggs. Those eggs are the parasites. The show planted the causal mechanism of next episode's disaster in the background of the previous episode and let it sit there, visible and unannounced, for anyone who looked. The Dan Harmon Vanity Card is a story told in images over multiple seasons. Harmon's production company, Harmonious Claptrap, has a brief animated card that plays at the end of every episode. In the early seasons, this card showed Harmon sitting happily on a couch with his wife and their pets. It was warm, domestic, a little self-conscious in the way that personal branding often is, but genuinely pleasant. Then, after Harmon's divorce in 2015, the card changed. The new version shows Harmon alone on a couch, surrounded by empty bottles, with only his animals present. The image is one of the most casually devastating things in the show's catalog, not because it's dramatic, but because it's quiet. It's a personal fact about one of the show's creators encoded into a 2-second image that appears after every episode. Most viewers never comment on it. It's just there, in the background, the emotional life of a real person running in parallel with the fictional one the show is building. Later, after Harmon entered a new relationship with writer and producer Cody Heller, the card changed again to something warmer. The card isn't branding, it's a diary. In the Vat of Acid episode, during the sequences set in various alternate timelines, a careful eye will spot Moe's Tavern from The Simpsons visible in the background of one of the scenes. Earlier in the same episode, Rick explicitly notes that Futurama did the plot device the episode is using before they did. Both Futurama and The Simpsons were created by Matt Groening. In a single episode, the show acknowledges its debt to Groening's work twice, once verbally, once visually. The verbal acknowledgement is obvious. The visual one requires you to be watching the background. The community connection runs throughout the show's DNA. Dan Harmon created both. In the episode where Rick asks the planetary hive consciousness Unity to create a television program for distraction during an extremely emotionally complicated moment in their relationship, Unity produces alien characters arranged in the exact formation of the community study group. The alien beings are different colors and entirely non-human in appearance, but the layout, the number of people, their relative positions, the general posture of the group is unmistakably the Greendale Community College study table. It appears in one of Rick's loneliest moments in the entire show. Harmon inserting the thing he made before this thing, as background decoration for a scene where Rick is losing someone. Background graffiti and signage in alien settings rewards pause buttons and full-screen viewing. There is writing visible on alien storefronts, bathroom walls, protest signs, and equipment throughout the series. Some of it is in the show's partially developed alien scripts, which fans have spent considerable effort analyzing using frequency analysis and contextual clues. Some of it is simply in English, deliberately placed where your eyes won't naturally rest during a normal viewing. The production team treats the backgrounds as additional canvases for content that exists independently of the main narrative. Some of the most pointed and specific jokes in any given episode are in the backgrounds, unseen by most of the audience. Jerry keeps a framed photograph of Doofus Rick in the garage. This detail exists and has never been commented on by any character. Doofus Rick was the alternate dimension version of Rick who was genuinely kind to Jerry, who treated him with warmth and actual respect, who was the first and possibly only version of Rick to look at Jerry and see something worth being kind to. After that episode, when Doofus Rick was gone, Jerry didn't throw the memory away. He printed a photograph. He put it in a frame. He placed it in the garage. The image of the one version of Rick who was ever nice to him, preserved on display in a room Jerry uses every day, says everything about his position in the family that none of the show's dialogue says quite as directly. It doesn't get a scene. Nobody references it, it's just there. The dead fly arrangement and the hidden lab. In a Season 3 episode, Summer moves around dead flies on the garage floor during a scene where she's looking for something useful. Later, with minimal ceremony, Rick realigns those dead flies into their original pattern. The floor splits to reveal a hidden entrance to a lab that shouldn't be there. The dead flies are the key to the lock. The arrangement of specific insect corpses in specific positions is the security system for a secret laboratory, which is the most Rick Sanchez solution to security that exists. This detail rewards a viewer who noticed Summer's earlier shuffling and understood what she was doing. The show's theme music is, according to the creators, an intentional parody blend of two things that have very little obvious relationship to each other. The opening title sequences of Doctor Who and the visual, tonal world of Hergé's Tintin comic books. The sweeping camera movement through impossible space, the sense of speed building towards something vast, the slightly vintage quality of the science fiction it's evoking. This takes the kinetic template of Doctor Who's opening sequences and runs it through an aesthetic sensibility influenced by Belgian adventure comics from the mid-20th century. The result is something that feels immediately iconic, while actually being a layered reference that most American viewers would never consciously identify. The time travel box. Rick's creative position on time travel as a narrative device is consistent and firm. He finds it sloppy and uninteresting as a story mechanism. The show very rarely uses conventional time travel. Rick's equations treat time as a vector rather than a scalar, implying he's already solved the directional question of time's movement and filed it away as a settled problem. And in his garage, across multiple episodes, there is a labeled box visible in the background. The label reads, "Time Travel Stuff." It's on a shelf, gathering dust. The entire narrative genre of time travel fiction dismissed as a box of forgotten equipment that Rick hasn't touched in a long time and doesn't miss. In the Citadel scenes across both major Citadel episodes, two characters visible in the crowd bear strong visual resemblance to Dipper and Mabel from Gravity Falls standing with their Rick, observable in the background of crowd sequences. Alex Hirsch, who created Gravity Falls, is a genuine friend of the Rick and Morty production team. His fingerprints appear throughout the show in small ways. He voiced Toby Matthews in Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, the boy Summer had a crush on, and the visual references to his characters in Citadel crowd scenes are mutual acknowledgement between two animated shows that share a sensibility about what animation can do when it takes itself seriously. Part 4. Everything Rick Sanchez is a complete character portrait. To understand Rick Sanchez properly, you need to start with what the show itself is willing to tell you about him, and then sit with what that means for long enough that it stops feeling abstract. Rick Sanchez of Dimension C-137 is, within the Central Finite Curve, the bounded segment of the multiverse, he helped design the smartest person alive. This is not something the show treats as hyperbole or exaggeration. Within its own internal logic, it is simply true. His intelligence allows him to build things that no other civilization, no other government, no other collection of scientists across thousands of years of galactic history has been able to replicate or even conceptualize. He built a functional portal gun in his daughter's garage. He has a working spaceship. He has created devices that manipulate consciousness, rearrange matter at the atomic level, synthesize completely new forms of life, and bend physical laws in ways that other beings in this universe treat as miracles. He is, in the strict sense, capable of miracles. He just doesn't call them that. Rick's characteristic vocal tick, the mid-sentence belch, the slightly slurred delivery, the burp talking that became one of the show's most identifiable audio signatures, has at least one real-world antecedent. The comedian Foster Brooks was known in the 1960s and 1970s for a specific character, a cheerfully drunk man whose speech had a particular quality, that slightly wet, interrupted, swimming quality of someone who has been drinking heavily and persistently. Roiland has mentioned drawing from this in various interviews, but the burp talk is more than a reference. It's a character function. Rick is drunk in virtually every scene he appears in. His intelligence and his alcoholism share the same breath, literally. You cannot separate his brilliance from his self-medication in his speech patterns. Both are present simultaneously every time he opens his mouth. Rick's catchphrase, "Wubba lubba dub dub," which he deploys with apparent glee across the early seasons, contains something that the show eventually reveals. In Bird Person's language, the phrase means, "I am in great pain. Please help me." Rick has hidden a distress signal inside a celebration. He says it at parties, in the middle of adventures, during moments of apparent triumph, and every time he does, he is simultaneously performing joy and transmitting agony. Nobody around him knows what it means. He has buried a cry for help inside something that sounds like a catchphrase, which is the most Rick Sanchez thing he could possibly have done. The design of Rick communicates things his dialogue doesn't always say. In early seasons, the animators gave his skin a subtle blue-tinged cast, a visual indicator of the level of alcohol circulating in his system at any given moment. His white hair isn't the natural result of aging in a conventional sense. It's the physical record of what he's been through. His posture slightly hunched, slightly tilted, the posture of a person who has stopped caring about how they present themselves in space, is the posture of someone who has concluded that the effort of presenting well is effort spent on other people's comfort at the expense of his own. But there's something about Rick that takes a long time to see clearly, because the show introduces it so gradually and so quietly that you absorb it before you've fully processed it. Rick is, at his absolute center, a person who has organized every aspect of his personality around a project, never experiencing the specific kind of loss he experienced once. This means running before anyone can leave. This means making himself indispensable, so that people tolerate him even when he is intolerable. This means intellectualizing every relationship to the point where the emotional content becomes invisible beneath layers of science and sarcasm. This means being drunk enough, often enough, that the clarity required to feel things directly is never fully available. His personality is not just who he is. It's what he built after his family was murdered, to make sure something like that could never reach him in exactly that way again. The backstory, assembled across seasons 3, 5, 6, and 7, tells us this. Rick C. 137 was, at one point in his life, a man who chose his family over the multiverse. Another version of himself, the one the show eventually calls Rick Prime, appeared at his door when C-137 was a young scientist working on early teleportation technology, and offered him the portal gun, offered him access to everything, the entire multiverse, every dimension, and every possibility it contained. Rick C-137 said no. He said he was happy. He had Diane. He had Beth. Still a baby. He wanted to stay where he was. Rick Prime, apparently unable to accept this refusal, and the reasons for his inability are among the show's most interesting open questions, bombed Rick's house, killed Diane, killed Beth, left Rick C-137 alive in the ruins of the specific life he had chosen when given the choice between life and everything else. The man we know, the brilliant, chaotic, nihilistic, occasionally tender, frequently destructive person living in the Smith's garage, is entirely the product of that moment. Not just influenced by it, not shaped by it, built from it. Every decision he made after that night is traceable to what happened that night. He eventually built his own portal gun. He went hunting. He moved through the entire multiverse, dimension by dimension, looking for the Rick who had taken his family from him. He killed other Ricks along the way, Ricks who weren't the right one, but who he treated as acceptable casualties of the search. Eventually, exhausted by the killing, he signed a peace agreement with a congregation of alternate selves, helped build the Citadel as part of that truce, and then, because the Citadel itself became another kind of trap, abandoned that too. He found a dimension where Rick Prime had already abandoned that dimension's Beth, where Diane had died of unrelated causes, and Beth had survived, alone, with her daughter Summer. He crashed his ship into that garage. He moved in. He built his life inside the ruins of someone else's life, with a Beth who isn't his original Beth and grandchildren he isn't technically the grandfather of. That is the family we meet in the pilot episode. The Smiths are Rick C-137's borrowed family. He is a man living an approximation of the life he was supposed to have, performing contentment he doesn't fully feel, constantly drinking, because the gap between the performance and the truth is something no amount of genius can close. Season 7 revealed the full scope of what Rick Prime did with something called the Omega device, not just killing Diane in one dimension, using a weapon capable of systematic multiversal erasure to eliminate every version of Diane from every reality simultaneously. There is no dimension, anywhere in the full expanse of the multiverse, where Diane Sanchez is still alive. Rick can't find an alternate version of her to reconnect with, not because he lacks the technology or the access, but because she simply doesn't exist anywhere. The woman he is still, at some level, trying to process losing. She is not dead, in the sense that living things die and leave a body and a history. She is impossible. She has been made not to have existed across every branch of reality. The Omega device isn't just a weapon, it's metaphysical erasure applied across all probability. Rick eventually kills Rick Prime. This happens in Season 7, and the show treats it with an unusual combination of release and emptiness that feels true in a specific way. Rick has been building toward this confrontation for his entire adult life. His portal gun, his adventures, his found family, his alcoholism, his philosophy of nihilism, every aspect of his existence has been organized, at some level, around this hunt. And then it ends. And Rick is left holding the fact that the thing that has been giving his pain a direction is gone. What's left when the direction disappears is just the pain itself, without the purpose that made it bearable. The show doesn't resolve this cleanly. It would be dishonest if it did. One technical detail that becomes a character detail: Rick specifically requires a Morty, because Morty's neural signature is compatible with his, in a way that helps mask Rick's genius-level brainwaves from detection. Rick's intelligence radiates. It's identifiable. Anyone who wants to find him can look for that signal. Morty's comparatively ordinary brain activity, in proximity to Rick's extraordinary activity, creates a kind of interference pattern that makes Rick harder to locate. Rick needs Morty to be invisible. This is the logistical explanation, and it's real within the show's logic. But the show accumulates evidence, season by season, that this isn't the whole truth. Rick keeps Morty close because Morty is the only relationship he has that contains something like unconditional love, not the love of someone who doesn't know what Rick is. Morty has seen most of what Rick is, and he comes back. He always comes back. And whatever Rick would say if asked about this, whatever defensive sarcasm or philosophical deflection he would deploy, the fact of his behavior tells you something different from what his words would. Part 5. The rest of the Smith family portraits of people under pressure. Morty Smith is 14 years old for the entire run of the show. This is worth holding on to, because it would be easy to let the competence he gradually develops cause you to forget how young he is. He isn't a young adult adapting to unusual circumstances. He is a 14-year-old boy, the age where identity is most in formation, the age where experiences leave their deepest marks, the age where the things that happen to you can genuinely shape the architecture of who you become. Rick is dragging a 14-year-old through experiences that would constitute severe psychological trauma for most fully formed adults. Combat. Witnessing death on large scales. Being responsible for decisions with life or death consequences. Discovering that alternate versions of himself are dying in their dozens while he watches. Burying his own dead body in a backyard. Being manipulated, used, protected, loved, and endangered by the same person, sometimes in the same scene. And Morty keeps going. Not because he has no choice, the show makes clear that on some level he does, but because the relationship with Rick, for all its costs, contains something he values. Something that his school life, his family life outside of Rick, his ordinary teenage social existence doesn't contain. He is important within the relationship. He matters. Rick, for all his cruelty, needs him. And being needed by the most powerful person you've ever met is its own kind of addictive thing. The episode Morty's Mindblowers is the most complete picture the show offers of what the adventures have actually cost. Rick has a secret archive, a whole room, hidden within the house full of vials containing memories he has extracted from Morty without Morty's ongoing knowledge. Not suppressed, physically removed. Stored. The archive is enormous. The number of vials implies a volume of experience that Morty hasn't processed consciously, because Rick removed the most traumatic episodes before they could settle into Morty's psychology. Rick has been maintaining Morty's functional stability by selectively editing his memory. He has decided unilaterally, which parts of Morty's own life Morty gets to keep. This is simultaneously the most protective and the most invasive thing Rick does for Morty. Protective because without it, the cumulative trauma would probably be impossible to carry. Invasive because it's a fundamental violation of Morty's right to his own experience. Rick has decided what Morty can handle and acted on that decision without ever asking. The care and the control are inseparable. Morty's anxiety, which runs through every episode, is the show's moral compass in a very specific way. When Morty is afraid, he hesitates. He says this feels wrong. He looks at what Rick is doing and responds to the consequences as consequences, not as logistics. In a relationship with a person who has spent decades training himself not to feel things directly, Morty's fear is the show's conscience, the voice that reminds the audience that flinching is the appropriate response to whatever is currently happening. Every time Morty panics, the show is reassuring you that the thing you're watching is actually as alarming as it seems. Evil Morty is the endpoint of the path Morty could take if the show continued in its current direction without intervention. Evil Morty is a version of Morty who went through all the same experiences but processed them differently. He stopped being afraid. He took the trauma and made it tactical. He took the experiences of being used and dismissed and endangered and turned them into intelligence about how the system works and where its vulnerabilities are. Evil Morty is what you get when Morty's empathy and his anxiety are filed away somewhere inaccessible, when the experiences harden rather than hurt. And he's the most effective person in the entire multiverse. Our Morty's relative goodness, his continued ability to feel distress on behalf of people who are hurting, including people he doesn't know, including people who are technically not real people, is what separates him from that endpoint. That capacity is the thing that's eroding, slowly, season by season, as the experiences accumulate. The show keeps asking, quietly, whether the trajectory Morty is on is one of growth or of loss. Most signs suggest both, simultaneously. Beth Smith is the character whose situation is most thoroughly defined by something that happened long before the show began. Rick left when she was a child. He simply wasn't there. And Beth grew up doing what children do when a parent disappears. She built an idealized version of him in her mind, and she spent her entire life trying to become worthy of the real one she imagined would eventually return. When Rick comes back, he doesn't match the idealized version. He is difficult and reckless and casually cruel and occasionally warm in a way that makes the cruelty harder to manage because it comes without warning. He is an unreliable source of exactly the thing Beth spent years imagining receiving from him. And she accepts it anyway. She lets him build a lab in the garage. She lets him take Morty on dangerous adventures. She defends him to Jerry even when Jerry is obviously right. She overlooks things that no rational person would overlook, because the alternative pushing back hard enough that Rick leaves is something she cannot psychologically tolerate. Beth became a horse surgeon. The show uses this as comedy, and it's earned comedy. But the distance between what her intelligence was probably capable of and where it ended up is not accidental. She was a teenager who got pregnant, married quickly for stability, and built a life in the suburbs. She did not have a father present to help her figure out what she wanted or what she was capable of. She made the safe choice because the alternative seemed too uncertain, and she has spent the years since measuring that choice against the life she imagined she was supposed to have and finding it wanting. Jerry Smith is the family's target of contempt, and the show is more interesting with him than it first appears. There are episodes clearly designed to humiliate Jerry. There are also episodes that quietly demonstrate that the contempt the family directs at him is obscuring something true. Jerry is more capable than anyone gives him credit for. He survived alone on an alien planet when he was accidentally abandoned there. He has talked his way out of situations that should have ended him. He has a specific kind of stubbornness that looks like incompetence from the outside, but functions like a survival mechanism in practice. The family is so busy looking down on him that they consistently underestimate what he's actually managing. And Jerry's one moment of genuine power forcing Beth to choose between him and Rick, holding firm, and watching Beth choose him is one of the show's most quietly meaningful moments. Jerry, the punching bag, the designated loser, the man whose primary narrative role is embarrassing himself, got the smartest person in the universe removed from the family home by simply being clear about what he wanted and refusing to back down from it. Summer Smith spends the early seasons on the margins of the adventure, and the show eventually gives you the context for why this positioning feels significant to her. She was an unplanned pregnancy. Beth and Jerry briefly considered not keeping her. This detail, revealed in a moment of devastating clarity, recontextualizes her entire personality. Her need to be seen and acknowledged isn't teenage vanity. It's a response to a fear she has carried since before she understood it. The fear of being unnecessary, of being optional, of being an accident that could have gone differently. Every time Summer pushes her way into one of Rick's missions uninvited, she is asserting the same thing she has always been asserting. I belong here. I deserve to be here. My presence in this family is not a mistake. Her gradual development of genuine capability, her growth into someone who can handle herself in dangerous situations, who Rick eventually has to respect, is earned through exactly this quality. She demanded a seat at the table before anyone offered her one. Part 6. The Citadel, the Curve, and the Architecture of Control. The Central Finite Curve is one of the most ambitious pieces of world-building in the history of animated television, and it was delivered in a way that made most of its audience feel the weight of it before they fully understood what it meant. The multiverse is infinite. It contains every possible version of every possible event. Among infinite realities are realities where Rick Sanchez was never born, where he died young, where he grew up to be an unremarkable person with a regular job and a life that no one would make a show about. By pure probability, most of the multiverse contains universes where Rick either doesn't exist or is not particularly important. In the full expanse of infinite possibility, Rick-dominant universes are a subset. Rick C-137, in the aftermath of losing his family, built a portal gun. He then spent years hunting. He traveled and killed and eventually exhausted himself. As part of a peace agreement with other versions of himself, he helped build the Citadel and, separately, helped design the Central Finite Curve. The curve is a boundary, a division, applied to the multiverse that separates all realities where Rick exists, and is the smartest person alive from everything beyond. Every interdimensional adventure the show has ever depicted has taken place inside this boundary. Every portal Rick opens leads into a curated section of reality. The infinite possibilities the show seemed to offer were never really infinite. They were bounded by a wall that Rick himself helped construct. Evil Morty describes this with a specific phrase: an infinite crib built around an infinite baby, which is, if you think about it, devastatingly precise. The curve doesn't just protect Ricks. It ensures that wherever any Rick goes, he is the apex predator, the most capable entity, the one who can always outthink, outbuild, outrun whatever he encounters. It's not even about survival. It's about maintaining the one thing that Rick's identity requires: being the most powerful thing in the room. The Citadel of Ricks is the social structure inside that boundary. Thousands of Ricks from thousands of dimensions pooling resources, building a civilization. The show's 2 major Citadel episodes spend considerable time showing what this society actually looks like on the inside, and what it looks like is recognizable in the most uncomfortable possible way. There are rich Ricks and poor Ricks. There are Ricks who run factories and Ricks who govern. There are Ricks who set the rules, and Ricks who get crushed by them. The Citadel is not a utopia of genius. It is a stratified, unequal, corrupt, self-serving social order that mirrors every human society the real world has ever produced, just with more advanced technology. The mechanism of the Citadel's cohesion is the same mechanism that holds most unjust social orders together. The people at the bottom believe in the system's core premise enough to not challenge it. Every Rick at the Citadel, no matter how poor, no matter how exploited, no matter how far down the social hierarchy, shares the belief that Ricks are better than Mortys. He might resent the Ricks above him. He might think the system is unfair within its Rick hierarchy, but he still believes that Ricks, as a category, are superior to the alternatives. As long as there's someone below him in the structure, he can tolerate being below someone else. This is not an invented dynamic. It is the mechanism of almost every real social hierarchy ever constructed. The Mortys at the Citadel attend school. They are educated. But the curriculum is oriented entirely around service, around becoming better sidekicks, more compliant partners, more psychologically suited to the role the Citadel has assigned them. They are not encouraged to think about their own interests or their own potential or their own futures as independent people. They are trained to be useful to Ricks. The institutionalization of this is arguably more disturbing than what any individual Rick does to his individual Morty, because it suggests that the dynamic between Rick and Morty in the show's central relationship isn't an aberration. It's the system working as intended. Evil Morty's election to the presidency of the Citadel is the show's most politically charged moment. He runs as a Morty. The Ricks laugh. They do not take it seriously. They have so thoroughly convinced themselves that a Morty could never be a genuine threat to a Rick-run institution that they perform only the minimum amount of opposition a candidacy requires. They are not frightened by the campaign. They are mildly amused by it. This is their fatal mistake. Evil Morty understands something the Ricks cannot see from inside their own worldview. The Morty voting population is enormous and has been systematically neglected and condescended to. They are primed to vote for anyone who acknowledges their experience. Evil Morty tells them what they already know. He offers them recognition. He wins, not because he's more powerful than the Ricks, but because he understood the system's rules better than the people who built it. What happens after Evil Morty wins is the more significant thing. He doesn't govern. He doesn't try to reform the Citadel. He doesn't use the presidency for the thing most people would use a presidency for. He uses the institutional resources, the technology, the accumulated power of the presidency to build the thing he's been building toward for years, a mechanism to break through the Central Finite Curve. He tears apart the Citadel, uses its resources as fuel for the breach, and steps through the hole he's made into the wider multiverse. Into the part of reality that the Ricks never had access to. The part that doesn't guarantee Rick is the most powerful thing around. The image of Evil Morty in his small ship, alone, flying through the breach, leaving the destroyed Citadel behind him, is one of the most visually beautiful and emotionally enormous moments the show has produced. The song that plays over it for the Damaged Coda by Blonde Redhead is a piece of music that sounds exactly like what the moment needs. Slow, melancholy, patient. Something that has been waiting for this for a very long time, and is now watching it arrive. Part 7. How it gets made: production secrets and behind-the-scenes facts. The production of Rick and Morty involves craft and chaos in proportions that mirror the show's content. There is meticulous planning, and then there is the specific kind of creative chaos that happens when highly imaginative people are given genuine creative latitude, and both produce the final result in ways that are difficult to separate after the fact. The animation software is Toon Boom Harmony, which is an industry standard for frame-by-frame digital animation, a sophisticated platform used by many professional animation studios. Background art is built in Adobe Photoshop. Post-production compositing happens in Adobe After Effects. This is not unusual for a network animated show of this period and budget. What's unusual is the visual style the production team achieves within these tools, a slightly loose, slightly imprecise aesthetic that doesn't have the crisp perfection of major studio animation, or the completely flat vector look of shows like Archer. Rick and Morty looks like someone drew it quickly and brilliantly, which creates the impression of improvisation even when the actual production is painstaking and precisely constructed. The improvisational quality in the voice acting is not staged. Roiland's recording sessions involved long stretches of unscripted riffing, following the scene's energy wherever it went, chasing down lines that weren't in any draft of the script, finding things in the moment that nobody had written. The production team recorded these sessions in their entirety and transcribed them afterward, mining the transcripts for material worth integrating into the final cut. Some of the show's most beloved moments, the specific lines and exchanges that get quoted most frequently, were not written. They were discovered in recording sessions by someone following an impulse. 60 Minutes, which is the show's most purely improvisational episode, was constructed in an unusual order. Roiland and Harmon sat in a recording booth and improvised a marathon of alien television programming. Alien game shows, alien talk shows, alien commercials, alien news broadcasts. They just went, and the animators built the visuals afterward to match what had been recorded. This is the reverse of the normal production order. Normally you animate to a script and record dialogue to match the animation. For 60 Minutes, the audio came first and everything else followed it. The result is the loosest, most alive-feeling episode in the series. It sounds like people actually watching television together and riffing on what they see. Roiland originally conceived the show with 11-minute episodes. He saw the project as quick, dense, fast-moving, something that burned bright and didn't linger. Adult Swim pushed for full half-hour episodes. This decision, made for network scheduling and formatting reasons, turned out to be perhaps the most consequential creative choice in the show's history. The half-hour format is what created the space for grief. For the quiet moments at the end of episodes where the joke is over and what's left is something true. For the scenes that don't resolve. For the emotional weight that accumulated into the show's most powerful episodes, 11-minute episodes can do funny very well. Half-hour episodes can do funny and then quietly break your heart in the remaining time. The second episode, Lawnmower Dog, has an origin the show itself winks at. The premise, Snuffles the dog gaining super intelligence, is drawn from a pitch Roiland had previously developed for Cartoon Network called Dog World, where two kids find a portal to a world of intelligent dogs. The pitch apparently didn't go anywhere, and its elements were absorbed into the Rick and Morty universe. In the episode, Rick says to Morty that he wonders what an intelligent dog world would be like. Morty enthusiastically describes its potential as a satisfying concept for audiences of all ages. They're joking about the recycled concept from inside the episode that uses it. The show's relationship with The Simpsons is one of mutual recognition rather than competition. Rick and Morty appeared in the couch gag for the season 26 finale of The Simpsons, a brief animated sequence in the opening credits, voiced by Roiland. The couch gag has historically been used to acknowledge things the Simpsons team considers culturally significant, so Rick and Morty's appearance in it represents a specific kind of welcome into a tradition. In later episodes, Rick and Morty return the acknowledgement with specific visual and verbal references to both The Simpsons and Futurama, acknowledging the lineage. The Season 3 development period was unusually turbulent. The gap between Season 2 and Season 3 was almost 2 years, a long wait that was widely discussed among fans, and that the show itself referenced with the famous April Fool's Day premiere. Adult Swim aired the Season 3 premiere episode on the 1st of April 2017, unannounced, and looped it for 4 hours. No promotional campaign, no press run-up, just the episode, appearing on the network, for people who happened to be watching. 3 million unique viewers tuned in that day. The Ryan Elder score is one of the most underappreciated elements of the show's craft. Elder's music has a specific quality. It sits underneath the comedy without undermining it, but it's capable of doing significant emotional work in the moments when the show needs it. The tonal management this requires is extraordinarily difficult. Comedy music that is also genuinely sad when sadness is required, without the comedy register ever feeling like it's being faked, is a musical problem that very few composers solve. Elder solves it by writing music that is patient rather than insistent. It doesn't push the emotion. It waits for it, and when the scene creates the space, the music is already there. The recasting of Season 7 was, by any reasonable expectation, something that should have damaged the show significantly. Roiland had voiced both main characters for 6 seasons. His vocal performances weren't just performances, they were part of the show's identity. The specific quality of his Rick voice, the specific quality of his Morty voice, the specific way they interacted with each other because they shared a throat, all of this was baked into what the show sounded like. When Adult Swim separated from Roiland in January 2023, the show faced a creative challenge with no obvious right answer. They auditioned widely. They found Ian Cardoni for Rick, a Boston-area native who had done voiceover work throughout his career, including promos for WWE and Sci-Fi, and Harry Belden for Morty. They kept the casting secret until the Season 7 premiere on the 15th of October, 2023, when both actors were credited for the first time. The decision to cast 2 people rather than finding one person to do both voices was practical and philosophically interesting. Practical because the work of voicing both characters had reportedly been a significant burden on Roiland over the years, and the production team didn't want to replicate that situation. Philosophically interesting because splitting Rick and Morty between different actors means their relationship is now, literally, a collaboration between 2 different people, which creates a different kind of chemistry than a single person performing both. Whether that difference is perceptible to most viewers, whether it's a loss or a change, or simply a continuation, is something each viewer gets to decide. Part 8. When the show touched the real-world cultural impact, there is a particular kind of cultural phenomenon that doesn't arrive with the apparatus of a launch campaign. It doesn't need advanced press coverage or a coordinated social strategy. It arrives because the people who find it can't stop talking about it, and the conversation spreads until people who haven't seen it start to understand that something is happening. Rick and Morty arrived that way. Slowly at first, then suddenly. The show's early seasons built an audience that was disproportionately intense relative to its raw viewer numbers. People who watched it didn't just watch it, they annotated it. They built communities organized around discussing it. They published analyses of individual episodes that were longer and more carefully argued than most academic papers. There was something about the show's density, its willingness to layer meaning under comedy, under meaning again, to put important things in backgrounds and throwaway lines, to trust the audience to catch things that weren't being flagged, that created a specific kind of fan engagement. Every viewing produced something the previous viewing had missed. Every new viewing was a new conversation with the show. And then, in 2017, the show reached out from the screen and changed the real world in a way that became a case study in marketing, in social media, in the relationship between entertainment and consumer behavior. It did this by mentioning a dipping sauce. The Season 3 premiere aired on the 1st of April 2017. At the end of the episode, Rick delivers a monologue that functions as a fake reveal of his series-long motivation. He didn't care about saving his family, he explains. He didn't care about defeating the Galactic Federation. He wanted McDonald's Mulan Szechuan dipping sauce, a promotional condiment the chain had offered briefly in 1998 to coincide with the Disney animated film Mulan. Rick announces that this is his series arc, that if it takes 9 seasons, he's going to get that sauce. The sauce had been gone for nearly 20 years. Most people had forgotten it existed. The moment the episode aired, McDonald's social media was flooded. The chain's manager of culinary innovation, Mike Harach, was apparently deluged with requests reportedly encouraged in some of this by Roiland. McDonald's initially responded by sending Roiland an enormous jug of the sauce with a note playing along with the in-universe logic. Then they announced an official one-day return for the 7th of October 2017. The restaurants were overwhelmed. The supply was insufficient for the demand by an enormous margin. Lines stretched for hours. When the sauce ran out, which happened quickly at most locations, scenes of genuine chaos followed. Arguments broke out. Police were called to some locations. A single packet of the sauce sold on eBay for more than $14,000. All of this for a promotional chicken dipping condiment tied to a 20-year-old Disney film, resurrected entirely because a fictional scientist said he wanted it. McDonald's came back in February 2018 with a properly scaled response. 20 million packets distributed nationally to every U.S. location. The man who had originally developed the sauce for the chain, Mike Ryan, who was also responsible for the McFlurry and the McGriddle and stuffed crust pizza at Pizza Hut, described this as the strangest contribution to the cultural record of his entire career. His name is attached to several significant food industry milestones. The thing that most completely surprised him was a dipping sauce from 1998 that a cartoon brought back from the dead. The show's influence extended into domains the creative team probably didn't anticipate. Physics educators noticed a measurable uptick in student questions about quantum mechanics and multiverse theory following seasons that dealt heavily with those concepts. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which had been a relatively niche topic outside physics departments, started appearing in Google searches from demographics that had never encountered it before the show introduced it in its particular way. Science communicators cited Rick and Morty as a gateway to their audiences. People who hadn't known what they were interested in discovered they were interested in physics through a drunk cartoon scientist. The Szechuan situation became a business school case study. It appeared in marketing conferences. It was cited in papers about social media-driven consumer behavior. A dipping sauce, a cartoon, $14,000 on eBay. The show had demonstrated that a sufficiently devoted audience could redirect the decision-making of a global fast food corporation through collective enthusiasm, and this was interesting to people who studied these things. There was also a darker dimension to the cultural moment that the show's creators addressed repeatedly and publicly. As the fanbase grew and the show became a cultural marker, a vocal subset of fans began using the show's intellectual content as a badge of personal superiority. The show's reputation for complexity was weaponized by some viewers to dismiss other people, to suggest that liking Rick and Morty meant you were smart, and that not understanding or not liking it meant you were not. This was exactly the posture the show itself consistently criticized through the Rick character. Rick's intelligence doesn't make him good. It doesn't make him right. It doesn't make his relationships work or his life satisfying. The show was using Rick in part to examine the pathologies that very intelligent people develop, and some viewers were performing those same pathologies in the name of the show. Harmon addressed this directly and unglamorously, noting in various interviews that using a cartoon about a depressed, nihilistic alcoholic as evidence of your personal intelligence was missing something fairly fundamental about what the show was doing. It was not a flattering mirror for that behavior. That was part of the point. The Gravity Falls connection produced one of the more charming interpersonal stories in contemporary animation. Alex Hirsch and the Rick and Morty team maintained a genuine creative friendship that showed up in both shows in small, warm ways. Hirsch appeared in a Rick and Morty episode. Gravity Falls visual references appeared in Rick and Morty crowd scenes. Both shows were produced during a window when creator-driven, genuinely ambitious, deeply personal animated television was finding an audience, and the people making those shows knew they were part of something unusual together. The show's appearance in The Simpsons' couch gag is a specific kind of cultural canonization. The couch gag has historically acknowledged things that The Simpsons team considers worthy of recognition. When your show appears in it, you've been welcomed into a tradition that The Simpsons helped establish for American animated comedy. Rick and Morty earned that welcome after 3 seasons, which is a short time to build the kind of profile that gets you a couch gag. The show's influence on the internet's vocabulary has been quietly substantial. Phrases from the show entered general circulation in ways that are difficult to trace precisely but are clearly real. People use wubba lubba dub dub without necessarily knowing what it means. Get Schwifty has appeared in contexts entirely unrelated to the show. Squanching became a verb that people deployed in regular conversation, even when they couldn't describe what a squanch is. The show's language became a shared vocabulary for a generation of viewers, a set of markers that signaled membership in the audience without requiring any explanation. The fandom also produced an unusually high volume of academic and near-academic content. Video essays analyzing individual episodes, papers examining the show's philosophical positions, analyses of its narrative structure and its relationship to various television traditions. This is not typical of animated comedy fanbases. It reflects something about what the show was doing, the sense that it had enough going on under the surface to sustain serious, sustained engagement, that the joke was not all there was. The show invited analysis, and the audience responded to the invitation. The show's relationship with nihilism is interesting to track over its run. Early seasons leaned into a very specific flavor of nihilism, the kind that says, nothing matters, so you might as well do whatever you want, so you might as well have adventures, so you might as well enjoy the chaos. This was presented with something like enthusiasm. Rick's worldview is bleak, but he navigates it with a kind of furious energy that makes the bleakness feel almost fun. The show wore its nihilism loudly. Later seasons complicate this. The show starts presenting nihilism not as a liberating philosophy but as a coping mechanism, as something Rick adopted because genuinely believing that nothing matters protects you from feeling how much things matter to you. The nihilism isn't wrong exactly, but it isn't the full truth. The full truth includes Morty. It includes Bird Person. It includes Diane, the AI in the house calling from another room. The things that matter to Rick are real, and his elaborate philosophical architecture is designed to keep him from having to face how real they are. This is the show's most significant development as a piece of storytelling. It begins appearing to agree with its protagonist's worldview, and gradually reveals that it's actually examining that worldview critically. Rick's nihilism is not presented as wisdom in the end. It's presented as trauma dressed in the vocabulary of philosophy, which is, as it happens, a fairly precise description of how nihilism tends to function in the lives of real people who adopt it. Part 9. The Darkest Corners? What the Show Won't Look Away From. Rick and Morty is genuinely good at a specific trick, making you laugh at something before you've fully processed what it actually is. By the time the real weight of a thing arrives, you're already in the next scene. You carry the thing with you without quite knowing you picked it up. Let's sit with some of the heavier ones for a while. The Meeseeks. On the surface, pure comedy gold. A tall, blue, cheerful creature that manifests from a box, completes a task, and then ceases to exist. The episode is funny. It escalates brilliantly. The image of a mob of Meeseeks descending on a golf course while all of them simultaneously process their existential anguish is genuinely hilarious. This is not in dispute. But a Meeseeks is a conscious being. It experiences existence subjectively, it knows it's alive, and being alive is, by the creature's own account stated plainly, in the episode, without ambiguity agony, not discomfort, not inconvenience, agony. Every moment of consciousness for a Meeseeks is a form of suffering. The only relief available is completing the assigned task and ceasing to exist. The task is the finish line for an experience that is painful simply by virtue of happening. Rick made these things. He designed them this way. He built beings for whom existence is intolerable and then engineered enthusiasm for service into them so that the intolerance could be managed rather than resolved. They are what he invented, not an accidental byproduct of some other experiment. He sat down and made something that suffers and made its suffering manageable by giving it a purpose and a death. The Meeseeks box is one of Rick's most commonly used and casually displayed inventions, and it is, on examination, a machine for generating suffering and offering the sufferers a merciful release in exchange for completing your task. It's on a shelf in the garage. Between the time travel stuff and the portal gun charger, the Cronenberg episode Rick Potion Number 9 handles its darkness in a different register. It ends with Rick and Morty burying their own dead bodies in the backyard of a house belonging to the versions of themselves who just died. Rick gets a beer and watches television. Morty sits on the couch and stares at nothing. The scene only works because of what it's not saying. Rick's ability to do this, to accept catastrophic loss and simply continue, is not presented as strength. It's presented as something that has been trained into him by decades of having to do exactly this. He has rebuilt from zero before. He has the framework. He knows how. For Morty, this is the first time. Morty doesn't have the framework. What he has instead is a couch to sit on while he tries to process having done something that his entire emotional and moral framework says he should not have survived. And in subsequent seasons, you watch Morty develop the framework. You watch him learn Rick's particular mode of continuing. You watch the hesitations become smaller, the recovery times grow shorter, the processing get faster, and the show frames this not as growth but as loss. Every adaptation Morty makes is costing him something. He is becoming more capable and less himself simultaneously. The question is whether what's left at the end of the adaptation will still be recognizable as the person he started as. Rick built an AI that sounds like Diane. This is revealed in Season 6, in the episode Solarix. Rick kept his original house in Dimension C-137, the house where Diane was killed, and he built into it a voice. An artificial intelligence that speaks in Diane's voice. That sounds as if she's calling to him from the other room, that is programmed not to comfort him, but to remind him of his failure to save her, to urge him toward revenge, to keep the wound from closing. He went back to the house where his wife died and installed a machine to make sure he never stopped feeling the loss in its full acuity. He created a haunting and then chose to return to it whenever the grief felt like it was growing manageable. That is not grief processing. That is grief preservation. The deliberate maintenance of maximum pain, because the alternative, the grief fading, the wound becoming scar tissue, would feel like abandoning Diane a second time. Beth's childhood, assembled from implications across several episodes, contains a picture that the show never makes fully explicit, but allows you to build from available materials. Rick built her toys that were, functionally, weapons. The show implies that child Beth had impulses toward violence, and that Rick, rather than discouraging these impulses, built her the means to act on them. There are references to incidents in her childhood that remain deliberately vague. There are suggestions that other children may have been hurt. The version of Beth who became a suburban horse surgeon and a wife and mother is, the show implies, someone who has built a life that contains her. The normal life is not just what she chose. It's also what keeps something darker from having more room. Rick's alcoholism is treated with unusual seriousness for a comedy. It's not a character quirk. It's not primarily comic, though it's sometimes comic. The drinking is what keeps the clarity at bay. Rick, sober and still, would have to sit in full, unobstructed view of everything he's lost and everything he's done, and the show suggests, consistently, that this is something he is genuinely not capable of surviving without the buffer. The alcohol is medication. Badly prescribed, self-administered, destructive over time, but medication for a specific thing. Dr. Wong's speech to Rick in the therapy scene, from Pickle Rick, is the show's most direct articulation of this. She's not unkind. She's precise. She tells him that his genius doesn't make him special in the way he needs it to. She tells him what it's actually for. Not for discovery, not for helping people, for running. For ensuring that the boring, unglamorous, emotionally demanding work of actually being a person with relationships and feelings and consequences never has to happen. His intelligence is the armor. And behind the armor, she tells him, is someone who is choosing to be miserable, because misery is familiar and connection is terrifying. Rick cannot respond to this. She's right, and he knows she's right, and the only thing he can do is drink instead. The scene is 4 minutes of the most accurate writing about a certain kind of emotionally avoidant, brilliant person that television has produced, and it happens inside an episode about a man who turned himself into a pickle to avoid going to therapy. The show's treatment of grief as a long-running structural condition, rather than a temporary narrative state, is one of its most unusual qualities. Most television treats grief as something that happens in episodes or arcs. A character loses someone, experiences the grief, moves through it, and emerges on the other side changed. Rick and Morty treats grief as a permanent weather system. Rick doesn't process his grief. It doesn't arc. It persists, largely unchanged, from the first episode to the most recent one. The specific loss of Diane hasn't become background to him across the decades since it happened. It remains primary. The AI voice calling from another room. The avoidance of any dimension where Diane existed. The drinking. The running. None of this is aftermath. This is still the event. This is, as it happens, how grief works for some people in real life. Some losses don't process through. They don't become scars. They remain wounds. The therapeutic model of grief, the stages, the eventual acceptance, the integration of loss into a life that continues is a model, not a universal truth. There are people for whom a specific loss stays present and immediate for decades, for whom the acute phase never fully resolves. Rick is the show's portrait of that kind of person. And the show treats it without judgment and without resolution, which is the honest treatment. The darkness that runs through the show's treatment of science is worth naming directly. Rick's inventions are frequently presented as enabling wonderful things, and, in almost the same moment, as creating enormous suffering. The portal gun gives access to infinite possibility, and it also gave Rick the means to hunt down his family's killer across decades and thousands of dimensions. The intelligence that allows Rick to do things no other being can do is also the intelligence that allowed him to build the Central Finite Curve, which imprisoned countless realities in Rick's self-serving construction. The Meeseeks box solves small problems and creates small existential horrors. The love potion was supposed to help and turned into an extinction event. The show is not anti-science exactly, but it's deeply skeptical of the idea that intelligence and the technologies it produces are inherently good. Intelligence is a tool. The tool does what the person wielding it directs, and the show's most intelligent character is frequently using that intelligence in ways that are ambiguously or straightforwardly harmful. The show never lets you fully celebrate Rick's genius without noticing what it costs. The two things are always present simultaneously. Part 10. The theories that proved true, and the mysteries still open. Rick and Morty invites a specific kind of fan engagement. The density of the show's detail, the long gaps between seasons, the habit of hiding important information in backgrounds and throwaway lines. All of this creates an audience that pays close attention and theorizes. Some of those theories turn out to be exactly right. Some remain open. A few have been explicitly denied. Most live in the comfortable middle space, where the show's creators give answers that could support multiple readings. The Central Finite Curve theory existed in fan communities for years before the show confirmed it. The reference in Season 1's Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind accounts Rick describing C-137 as sitting at the exact center of the curve was noted and built from. Fans constructed the framework. The curve is a deliberate separation of Rick-dominant realities from the wider multiverse, built by the Ricks as a self-serving measure to guarantee their own supremacy. Every adventure Rick takes is within this bounded space. The infinite multiverse the show appears to depict is actually a curated subset. When Season 5's finale confirmed this in Evil Morty's explicit monologue, it rewarded years of careful attention, but it also reframed the entire preceding run of the show retroactively. Every portal, every adventure, every alternate dimension, all of it was inside the crib. The revelation didn't change what happened. It changed what it meant. The Diane theory went through multiple stages of confidence and contradiction. The Season 3 premiere depicted a backstory Rick's memory of Diane's death that Rick himself subsequently waved away as fabricated. This was an extraordinarily frustrating narrative move for fans who had found the backstory emotionally resonant and meaningful. The show spent 2 seasons maintaining ambiguity about whether the backstory was true. Season 5's finale confirmed it was. Season 7 explained the Omega device and the complete erasure of Diane from the multiverse. The theory that the backstory was real and that Rick's denial of it was itself a kind of evidence for how painful it was turned out to be correct in all its significant details. The ticket theory from Morty Night Run is the show's most famous unresolved mystery. Rick receives a ticket numbered 5126 at the Jerry Barrie. At the end of the episode, another Rick is seen holding ticket 5126. The implication is that a dimensional swap happened mid-episode, that the Rick and Morty who pick up the Jerry aren't the same Rick and Morty who dropped him off. This would explain why Mr. Poopybutthole appears as a long-standing family friend in the following episode, despite never having been seen before. He might be a genuine friend of a different Rick and Morty. The show has never confirmed or denied this theory, which might itself be the most interesting answer. Evil Morty's dimension of origin, designated 79 Vector V, is a detail that fans spent considerable time trying to identify before Season 7 made it explicit. The confirmation came alongside the revelation that Rick Prime's Omega device had also affected this dimension, that Evil Morty's world was also shaped by the same violence that shaped C-137. Evil Morty and our Rick share a wound, inflicted by the same Rick Prime, and have responded to it in entirely opposite ways. One became a person who feels too much and runs from it. One became a person who feels nothing and runs toward power. The symmetry is quiet and the show doesn't underscore it. The Space Beth question, which of the two Beths is the original, is the show's deliberate non-answer. Rick clones Beth in Season 3. In the season finale, he admits that he doesn't know which one he gave the original life to. He made the choice and then either genuinely couldn't remember or decided not to know. The show has maintained this ambiguity across subsequent seasons with apparent intention. The Beth who stayed and the Beth who left are both treated as equally real by everyone who loves them. The narrative implication is that the question of authenticity is less important than the question of who each of them is now, which is itself a meaningful statement about identity. The foreshadowing in Rick's conspiracy wall in Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind includes the photograph of Aberdolf Linkler, who hadn't appeared yet. This has never been formally explained. It sits there, in the background of a scene, in a show that tends to reward being looked at carefully. Whether it means Rick's awareness extends in non-linear temporal directions, or whether it's a production choice that placed a future character in the scene before the episode, where they appear both readings are still live. The show tends not to close these off. What lies beyond the Central Finite Curve is, at the time of writing, the show's biggest open question. Evil Morty went through. The breach he created disrupted the Citadel catastrophically and opened access to a part of the multiverse that no Rick or Morty inside the curve had ever reached. What that part looks like, what it means to exist in a reality not organized around Rick's supremacy, is something the show hasn't shown yet. Whether it ever will is a question the show gets to answer at its own pace, in its own time. There is a long-standing fan theory about Rick's emotional relationship to his own timeline that the show has never explicitly confirmed or denied, but has done considerable work to support implicitly. The theory suggests that Rick C-137 remains in the Smith family's dimension, not because it's convenient or safe, or because he genuinely believes these are his people, but because this is the closest approximation of the life he was supposed to have that he was able to find and move into. He is living in someone else's life, in a dimension that doesn't technically belong to him, with a Beth who isn't his Beth and grandchildren who aren't descended from his family, and he knows this every moment he's there. The alienation underneath his connection to the family, the sense that his love for them is genuine and also somehow borrowed, secondhand, an imperfect copy of something that was destroyed, is built into his situation in a way that nothing about the show's surface presentation makes obvious. If this reading is correct, then Rick's particular flavor of emotional unavailability, the way he connects and then distances, the way he loves and then undermines, the way he stays and is also perpetually in the process of leaving, is not just a personality defect. It's a reasonable response to a situation where the people he loves are, in a technical but emotionally real sense, not the people he originally loved. He is mourning relationships he's currently inside. He is grieving the original versions of people who are standing right in front of him in close enough copies. That specific combination of presence and loss, happening simultaneously, would make anyone difficult to be around. The theory about why Rick specifically chose this dimension, why, out of all the available dimensions where his original family had died and left survivors, he moved into this one, connects to another detail the show provides. Rick Prime abandoned this dimension's Beth. Our Rick is specifically living in the dimension from which his enemy walked away. He is occupying Rick Prime's abandoned life. Whether this was a strategic choice, keeping himself as close to the trail as possible, ready to continue the hunt at any moment, or a strange kind of claiming, a refusal to let Rick Prime's abandonment of this family stand uncorrected, is something the show hasn't made explicit. Both readings are supported. Both produce a version of Rick that is more complicated and more interesting than the surface suggests. The question of what Rick would have become if Diane had lived is one of the show's most productive, unanswered questions. The show implies, through various pieces of evidence, that C-137 was not always the man we meet in the pilot. He was a young scientist who was happy, who chose his family over the multiverse when offered the choice, who was content enough that the decision wasn't difficult. If the bomb had never fallen, if Rick Prime had accepted the refusal and left, if Diane had lived and Beth had grown up with her father present, and Rick had continued working on his teleportation experiments and led a relatively normal life, would the man who emerged from that life be anything like the person the show depicts? Would he have the intelligence? Almost certainly. Would he have the darkness? Possibly not. The intelligence is Rick's. The darkness is what the loss made of the intelligence. And the show, by showing us who Rick is also showing us the shape of the absence of Diane in the outline of every terrible decision he's made since she died. Part 11. The languages, the music, and the small architecture. The show's partial alien language system is a project that the production team developed enough to be internally consistent within the show's visual design without developing it to the point of a full grammar or vocabulary. It appears on storefronts, graffiti, equipment labels, signs, and alien documents throughout the series. Fans who have attempted to decode it using frequency analysis and context clues have had partial success enough to establish that it's not random, that specific symbols appear in specific contexts with enough consistency to imply meaning. But it hasn't been fully decoded, and the creators haven't provided a Rosetta Stone. The bird-person language is more directly established because the show provides explicit translations. Wubba lubba dub dub is translated. The brief fragments of bird-person speech that occur in dialogue scenes are always meaningful within their scenes. The show treats alien language not as flavor but as content when it appears. It tends to be saying something real about the situation. Ryan Elder's score operates in a specific register that becomes most visible in the moments between jokes. There's a patience in his musical choices, a willingness to let a scene breathe after its emotional content has shifted, to stay with the feeling rather than rushing to the next one. This is not typical of animated comedy scores, which often operate as continuous energy management, pushing scenes forward, flagging jokes, maintaining pace. Elder's music knows when to stop doing that. The transition between Rick being absurdly funny and Rick being genuinely sad happens partly through Elder's score, creating the space for the transition to feel earned rather than sudden. The theme music, as noted by the creators, blends Doctor Who's opening title aesthetic with the visual sensibility of Tintin. This produces something that feels simultaneously like deep space and storybook adventure, like infinite possibility and contained narrative. The show is both of those things. It takes place across infinite reality, and it's also a story about two specific people. The theme captures this by being both sweeping and somehow intimate, vast enough to suggest the multiverse and specific enough to be instantly recognizable as belonging to this particular corner of it. The show has a specific visual language for portal gun effects that has become its most recognizable trademark. The acid green of the portals, a specific shade that has become synonymous with the show in merchandise and fan art and visual shorthand throughout popular culture, was a deliberate aesthetic choice. That particular green has qualities that work simultaneously as appealing and slightly unsettling. It's vibrant enough to be attractive and specific enough to be distinctive. It reads as both technological and biological, both synthetic and somehow organic. The portals look like wounds in the air that happen to be beautiful. The recurring background characters, the neighbors, the community members, the background, Earthlings who appear across multiple episodes despite the show's own logic, suggesting the Earth's population has changed multiple times, are handled with varying levels of consistency. The show acknowledges its own inconsistency sometimes, with winks. In other episodes, it seems to be suggesting that C-131, the dimension the Smiths moved into after Cronenberging C-137, has a population that conveniently looks exactly like C-137's. This is either a lazy narrative shortcut or a background joke. The show leaves it comfortably ambiguous. The community references aren't just the study group arrangement in the Unity episode. The show's entire narrative architecture has been influenced by Harmon's story circle, a storytelling structure he developed and used extensively on Community, based loosely on Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, but formalized into a specific 8-step cycle. The structure shows up in Rick and Morty episodes in various configurations. Harmon's story brain is visible in how episodes are built, even when the content is as far from Community as possible. The show's use of credit sequences and post-credit scenes is a specific and deliberate grammar. Many episodes contain post-credit content that ranges from brief comedic codas to significant character moments to entirely separate mini-stories. The post-credit scenes in Rick and Morty are not afterthoughts. They're sometimes the most important part of the episode. Close Rick Counters of the Rick kind uses its post-credit scene to show Rick's conspiracy wall, which recontextualizes the entire episode. Other episodes use post-credit content to show the aftermath of the episode's events from perspectives that weren't available during the episode itself, giving the audience information that changes how the previous 20 minutes feels. The title cards that appear at the beginning of episodes are their own small tradition of specific, often dark humor. The show uses the title cards to make tonal announcements that are sometimes ironic and sometimes sincere. A title card that promises a certain kind of story sometimes delivers that story, and sometimes delivers something that seems designed specifically to subvert the expectation the title card created. The show uses its own paratextual elements, the things that frame the episode, rather than comprising it as additional comedic and narrative space. The show's color design is worth extended attention. The green of the portals is the most obvious color choice. That specific acid green has become the show's visual signature. But there's a broader color philosophy at work. Rick's lab coat is white, suggesting scientific authority and also suggesting someone who is covered up, obscured, presenting a specific professional surface. The house's interior is rendered in domestic warm tones that are often in contrast with the cold blues and greens that dominate alien settings and interdimensional spaces. This color grammar communicates something about the relationship between the domestic and the cosmic, the warm, familiar space versus the cold, vast one that Rick keeps insisting on going back to. Mr. Poopybutthole is, of all the show's recurring elements, one of the most philosophically sophisticated. His appearance in Total Recall, as the character who turns out to be real, the character whose relentless positivity makes him look exactly like a parasite, who gets shot because genuine warmth is indistinguishable from manufactured warmth in a house that has been compromised, is a piece of writing that asks a genuinely dark question. If authentic kindness is so rare that it looks exactly like a lie designed to exploit you, what does that say about the environment that produced that rarity? What does it say about the relationships the Smith family has normalized? What does it say about Rick, whose presence has made the entire household unable to trust simple warmth? The post-credit scenes involving Mr. Poopybutthole across multiple seasons, his recovery, his time in the hospital, the gradual changes in his life visible in brief glimpses form a quiet parallel narrative. He goes through real things. His life changes in ways the show reveals only partially, in small installments, and through all of it, the warmth persists. Dimmed sometimes, strained, but present. The show keeps checking in on him as a way of checking in on whether kindness survives what happens to people over time. The answer, repeatedly, is yes. Not without cost, but yes. Part 12. What the show has become, where it stands now. In 2018, Adult Swim and the show's production company signed an agreement for 70 new episodes over an unspecified number of seasons. 70 episodes. This number reflected institutional confidence that was unusual in its scale. Networks don't order 70 episodes of anything they're uncertain about. The order was a statement. Rick and Morty is going to be a defining property for the foreseeable future. As the show has moved through its season 8 and into development of further seasons, what's clear is that the show survived its most significant disruption, the departure of Roiland, the recasting, the question of whether it could continue to feel like itself with different voices in the central roles, and came out on the other side of it with renewed momentum rather than diminished energy. Season 7 was received as one of the stronger seasons the show had produced. The lore resolutions were significant. The emotional clarity was present. The writing felt confident in a way that suggested the production team, freed from whatever complications the final years with Roiland had introduced, was finding a new gear. Ian Cardoni's Rick and Harry Belden's Morty have become, gradually and then definitively, the show's Rick and Morty, not the same as what came before. Different in ways that reveal themselves slowly under repeated listening, but truthful. The performances have their own qualities, their own textures, their own takes on the characters' emotional registers that are now accumulating history. In a few more seasons, this will simply be what the show sounds like. The transition will be complete in the way that all significant transitions in long-running creative works eventually complete, not with a ceremony but with the accumulation of new moments that are simply the new norm. The anime adaptation, Rick and Morty. The anime, produced in Japan by Takashi Sano and released in 2024, represents a remarkable fact about where the show stands culturally. A property that began as a crude American animated comedy made by two people who liked each other's brand of weird is now significant enough to be adapted into a full Japanese anime production, with a Japanese voice cast in a visual style that engages seriously with the show's characters and world, while being completely distinct in its aesthetic. The two productions exist simultaneously as legitimate expressions of the same fictional universe. The theme song to the anime Love is Entropy by Code of Zero is either a perfect accidental title or a deliberately chosen one that says something precise about what the show is about. The comics, which began in 2015, have expanded the universe across multiple volumes and crossovers. The Dungeons & Dragons crossover comic is its own particular artifact, a collaboration between an Adult Swim animated show and one of the most iconic tabletop role-playing game systems, committed to its premise with full sincerity. The comics give fan-favorite characters more room, explore corners of the universe the show hasn't visited, and create a supplementary mythology that the most dedicated audience members have incorporated into their understanding of the world. The video game ecosystem Pocket Mortys, the Pokemon-inspired mobile game where you collect and battle Morty variants, and Rick's inclusion as a playable character in Multiversus alongside characters from various other Warner Brothers properties represents the show's complete integration into the broader entertainment economy. Rick is now a character who exists in the same competitive fighting game space as Batman and Arya Stark. This would have seemed impossible to predict from the show's first season. It is now simply the situation. What remains consistent across all of this expansion, all of this merchandising and adaptation and cultural spread, is the core relationship. Rick and Morty at the center of everything. An old man and a boy. The most capable person in the universe, and a nervous 14-year-old who worries about his grades. They make each other worse in some dimensions and better in others. They save each other and endanger each other and damage each other with roughly equal frequency and usually simultaneously. They have secrets from each other that become less significant each season, as the secrets become harder to maintain. The show has a particular relationship with the promise it made in the pilot. Rick and Morty 100 years. Rick says it to Morty in the first episode. It's a grandiose promise. The kind that sounds like a joke and might be a joke and also might be the most serious thing in the episode. 100 years of this. 100 years of the adventures, the chaos, the relationship, the escaping and returning, the loving and failing each other and continuing anyway. The show is in no hurry to get there. It takes its time in the way that things built to last tend to take their time, not dawdling, but not rushing either. Each season adds to what's already there rather than replacing it. The lore deepens. The characters develop. The relationship between Rick and Morty accumulates weight that makes the earlier seasons feel, on rewatch, like a beginning rather than a middle. One thing the show has never lost across all its seasons is its willingness to be genuinely quiet at the right moment. The best episodes of Rick and Morty contain at least one scene that stops being funny and just sits with something real. Morty staring at nothing after burying his own body. Rick walking through his old house in C-137, listening to the AI voice of his dead wife. Beth standing in a field trying to figure out which choice she's actually making. Summer finding out she wasn't planned and having to do something with that information. These moments aren't rescued from their gravity by a joke. They're allowed to be what they are. The show trusts its audience to sit in discomfort without having to be immediately relieved of it. This quality, the willingness to be genuinely serious for a moment inside a show that is usually not, is what separates Rick and Morty from most animated comedy. The comedy is real. The show is genuinely funny, across its run, in ways that hold up on repeated viewing. But the comedy doesn't require that nothing matters. The show has figured out how to be funny and also mean it. How to make you laugh and then use the openness that the laughter created to put something true inside you that you'll carry out of the episode. That's the specific thing the show does. That's why it endures. Not the science, not the Easter eggs, not the multiverse, not the mythology, not any of the things we've spent these hours going through. Those are all real, and they're all part of what makes it worth watching carefully. But the reason people come back to it, the reason it keeps producing the kind of devoted audience that watches episodes multiple times and thinks about them afterward and talks about them to people who haven't seen them, it's the feeling of being understood by something, of watching a show that knows what it's like to be a person who is trying to figure things out in a universe that doesn't particularly care whether you succeed or not, and of finding that this is somehow, in the right light, a little funny. The show's real subject beneath the multiverse and the science jokes and the social commentary and the lore and the Easter eggs and the carefully placed background details is what it costs to love someone who is difficult to love, and what it gives, and why people do it anyway. Rick and Morty is, at its core, a love story between a man who has convinced himself he doesn't love anyone and a boy who loves him despite having every reason not to. Neither of them would say this. The show never says this directly, but it shows it in scene after scene, season after season, in the fact that Morty keeps going back and Rick keeps leaving the door unlocked. That's the show. That's the whole thing. All the portals and the Cronenbergs and the Meeseeks and the interdimensional cable and the Citadel and the Central Finite Curve and the Omega device and the AI ghost of Diane calling from another room, all of it is scaffolding around two people who need each other in ways they don't have the right words for, working through the specific problem of being related to someone who is both the most extraordinary and the most difficult person you've ever known. 100 years of Rick and Morty. That's what the pilot promised. We're somewhere in the middle of it, most likely. There are still a lot of episodes left. A lot of dimensions left to visit, a lot of questions left to ask, a lot of answers left to withhold until just the right moment. It's a good show. It earns the time you give it. And if you gave some of it tonight, while it got quieter and the room got darker and the day started to release its grip, that's exactly what this was made for. Sleep well. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, whatever's waiting on the other side of tonight, sleep well. If this was good company, please subscribe. It's free, it takes one tap, and it's genuinely how more of this gets made. Thank you for spending these hours here. And if you made it all the way through, if you listened to every section, every detail, every quiet observation about a show that rewards people who pay attention, then you already know something important. You're exactly the kind of person this was made for. The kind of person who finds it easier to rest when there's something worth thinking about quietly in the background. The kind of person who, even half asleep, is still listening, still curious, still here. That's a good thing to be. And that's the show, in the end. Not the portal gun, not the multiverse, not the explosions or the alien civilizations, or the philosophical one-liners delivered mid-burp. The show is about paying attention to the people in your life, to the things you feel and don't say, to the cost of running and the weight of staying, to the small details that only mean something if someone looked closely enough to find them. Rick and Morty rewards looking closely. So does everything worth loving. Now, rest.